Well, this week we'll be running 3 special reports on property, banking and how the government and regulators are handling bubble risk. First up, here's Michael Yander on all the little boxes.
A walk through Sydney's suburbs gives Lindsay David all the evidence he needs to declare Australia has a housing bubble.
This is a $1.38 million house that was sold at auction just a couple of weeks ago. And as you can see behind me, it's not a mansion, it's not a big house, it's a very old house that's probably destined to be knocked down and rebuilt on.
The former owners are retirees, packing up to move to Queensland. They told us they got $300,000 above the reserve price. Our super fund, they joked. But it's the young family who bought this 65-year-old weatherboard house 45 minutes drive from the city that Lindsay David worries about.
It's a beautiful neighbourhood. I mean, it's a nice neighbourhood. It's not a Beverly Hills, but we are priced in at a Beverly Hills, which is quite...
Beverly Hills, California.
Beverly Hills, California, not Beverly Hills, Sydney.
It's a slight exaggeration, but for 1.7 million Aussie dollars, you can buy this just up the road from the movie stars. Anecdotes are one thing, but what do the numbers show? While Australian capital city home prices rose a solid 68% over the past 10 years, they rose a spectacular 125% in the decade before. Go back over the past 40 years or so, and Australia has seen stronger house price growth than anywhere else in the world except Norway. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the chief economist of Australia's biggest home lender doesn't think there's a bubble.
Very strong demand for housing. We're building more, but not at a fast enough rate to catch up with that demand. Throw in low interest rates and you've got a mix that just points to high house prices, and certainly that's what we've been seeing.
But Lindsay David doesn't buy the housing shortage argument.
The data tells us that since 1996, Australia has essentially built a new dwelling for every 1.9 new residents.
In fact, over the past decade, Australia's built more new homes than England, which has twice the population. But not all those homes are being built where they're needed. Property analyst Louis Christopher says it's no coincidence that the most undersupplied market, Sydney, is also the most expensive.
At this point in time, we think the market's about 25% overvalued, and if our forecasts come in for this year, it'll actually get up to about 40% overvalued.
So that's pretty serious levels of overvaluation.
It is. It's probably about the second highest overvaluation point we've ever recorded.
But he says Sydney's the exception, not the rule.
We don't believe, for example, there's a national housing bubble. We can definitely pinpoint areas where the markets have not moved for a very long time and they are undervalued compared to incomes.
Many mining towns have seen their prices more than halve since the peak of the boom, and that's hitting some of the capital cities.
Perth, which we still regard as being an overvalued territory, is having a downturn. Rents have fallen by 8%. House prices themselves are being held up, probably because of the easy credit, but it's likely we're going to see some sort of correction there. Darwin is clearly in correction territory from what we can see.
Louis Christopher says Canberra, Adelaide and Hobart are fairly valued or even underpriced. But the international property analysts at Demographia beg to differ. On their measure, all 5 of Australia's biggest cities are severely unaffordable, with Sydney and Melbourne in the world's top 10. And it's all been funded by a bigger mountain of debt, now a record 154% of household incomes. Lindsay David argues that leaves the whole property market vulnerable to potential price falls of up to 50%.
What history tells us is that when bubbles burst, what happens is we move back to the long-term medians. So if Sydney had a long-term median of, say, somewhere between 5 and 6, you could see that we'll move back to the long-term median of 5 to 6 times income in the event of a deleveraging.
A crash needs a trigger, and housing expert Emeritus Professor Mike Berry says there are 2 likely threats. One is rising interest rates or moves to limit home lending. The other threat is an external shock.
Things like the Chinese economy suddenly hitting the wall. If that happened, then very quickly unemployment levels would start to rise in Australia and people start to get worried about the security of their income. That's when the demand for housing can fall quite significantly and quite quickly.
But it's also possible that the property market may ultimately collapse simply under the weight of its own debt.
When you look at the fact that households in this country hold $1.9 trillion of household debt, you wonder how it's ever going to be repaid. and how the banking system is going to be able to pump more debt into this housing market for house prices to grow. Because if they can't, well, that's it.